The corner table had become quieter after closing. Not silent. Never silent. Even after the last customer left, somebody always found a reason to stay. That Thursday evening was no different. Mark was wiping down the coffee machine, humming softly to himself. Mrs. Anderson sat at her favorite table with a cup of tea and a stack of spelling tests she insisted on correcting by hand, despite the computer sitting in her living room. Lily was pretending to help, which mostly meant stealing cookies from behind the counter whenever she thought her father wasn't looking. "I saw that." "I know." "Then why did you do it?" Lily grinned. "Because they taste better when they're stolen." Mrs. Anderson looked over her glasses. "I sincerely hope you never become a lawyer." "I was thinking astronaut." "Good." Mrs. Anderson smiled. "They steal considerably fewer cookies." The restaurant filled with quiet laughter. Across the room, Sophie sat at her corner table, finishing the last page of history homework for next autumn's class. Summer homework would be finished early this year. The table she sat on no longer felt only like the best seat in the restaurant. It felt like it belonged to her personally. Maria had spread a small stack of ivory envelopes across the counter. One by one, she carefully addressed them. Friends, neighbors, customers who had quietly become family. Mark carried over another cup of coffee. "You've been writing for an hour. I want to make sure I don't forget anyone." "You won't." Maria smiled. "I already did once." She held up another envelope. "Good thing Mrs. Anderson reminded me." Mrs. Anderson looked up without missing a beat. "Some people are too important to forget." Mark nodded. "That's true." Lily wandered over. "How many are left?" "Only one." The room slowly settled back into its comfortable rhythm. The scratching of a pen, the clinking of cups, the dishwasher humming in the kitchen. Maria reached for the final envelope. She wrote one name, then stopped. Her smile disappeared. Lily noticed first. "What's wrong?" Maria didn't answer. She simply turned the envelope around. Written neatly across the front were two words: Daniel Martinez. Nobody spoke. Mark quietly set down the coffee pot. Sophie stared at the envelope. Without looking up, Lily asked, "Who's Daniel?" Sophie closed her notebook. Very softly she answered, "My dad." Silence. Then she added, "I don't think he'll come." The next morning began exactly the way summer mornings now usually began at the corner table. Mark unlocked the front door at 7. 2 minutes later, Mrs. Anderson walked in already, exactly as she had every Friday since the start of summer vacation. Mark laughed. "You know we're not officially open yet." Mrs. Anderson looked around the empty restaurant and smirked. "I fail to see your point." "I was hoping for at least 3 minutes of calm. You may have that tomorrow." She hung her coat on the familiar hook beside the entrance. She had stopped asking permission. Nobody minded. It had somehow become her private hook. With the end of that school year, she had retired. And without missing a beat, she had begun to teach at the corner table. Every Friday more children arrived, brought by their thankful parents. Lily came through the connecting door to their apartment only moments later. "Morning, Mrs. Anderson." "Good morning, Lily." "Did you bring more spelling tests?" Mrs. Anderson sighed dramatically. "I did." "I feel very sorry for your students." You should feel equally sorry for the poor teacher. Lily laughed, then glanced toward the corner window. Almost automatically, Mark noticed. You know she's not here yet. I wasn't looking. No? I was checking the weather. Mark walked over beside her. The weather appears to be Sophie-shaped. Lily tried not to smile. I don't know what you mean. Of course you don't. At exactly 8:15, a familiar blue wheelchair appeared around the corner outside. Lily grinned. I told you the weather was improving. She hurried to hold the door open, before Sophie even reached it. You know, Sophie said, rolling inside, I can open doors myself. I know. Then why do you always do it? Lily shrugged. Because most times I get here first. Sophie rolled her eyes. You make absolutely no sense. So I've been told. Mrs. Anderson watched them with a smile that only teachers seem capable of wearing, one of quiet pride. Later, one customer, visiting for the first time, looked around the restaurant. He noticed Mrs. Anderson helping a little boy with his reading while waiting for breakfast. Curious, he asked Mark, does she work here? Before Mark could answer, Lily spoke. No. She smiled. She's our Mrs. Anderson. The gentleman looked confused. Mark simply nodded. That explains it perfectly. The man looked around again. He realized something unusual about the restaurant. People weren't only eating there. They were staying, talking, helping one another, laughing together. The corner table had quietly become something much larger than a neighborhood restaurant. It had become the place where the neighborhood happened. The weeks passed almost unnoticed. Summer has a curious way of doing that. The days became longer, the evenings warmer. The windows of the corner table stayed open until late, letting the smell of fresh coffee drift into Maple Street. Without anyone planning it, children began appearing every afternoon. Some came to escape the heat. Some came for lemonade. Some came because they knew someone would always be willing to help with homework they had been given for the summer. Mrs. Anderson claimed she was only there for tea. Nobody believed her. Least of all the children. One afternoon, a little girl appeared carrying a reading book almost as large as she was. She stood beside Mrs. Anderson's chair. Could you help me with chapter 4? Mrs. Anderson sighed dramatically. I was hoping to spend today doing absolutely nothing. The little girl smiled hopefully. So, Mrs. Anderson closed her book. Very well. She pointed toward the empty chair beside her. But if chapter 4 does not contain dragons, it doesn't. Then we'll simply have to improve it. Lily laughed from behind the counter. I think you're secretly enjoying this. Mrs. Anderson looked over her glasses. I have no idea what you mean. Mark whispered to Maria. She became a teacher because she likes children. Mrs. Anderson heard him. I became a teacher because somebody had to teach their parents proper grammar. The restaurant burst into laughter. Sophie had become just as much a part of the afternoon routine. Her corner table was still her corner table, only now, she rarely sat there alone. Sometimes children brought mathematics problems. Sometimes they wanted help with history. Occasionally, they simply wanted company. Lily insisted she wasn't helping. I'm only passing through. Nobody believed that either. Every few minutes, she became distracted by something happening elsewhere in the restaurant. Normally Sophie. Occasionally food. Sometimes both. Mark watched them from behind the counter, the same way he always had. Only now, he worried much less. Maria noticed. "You've stopped checking whether Lily is doing her homework." Mark smiled. "I gave up." "Really?" "No." He looked toward the corner table. "I discovered she studies more when she's helping someone else." Maria followed his gaze. Sophie was explaining fractions to a little boy. Lily was somehow turning the same lesson into a competition involving sugar packets. The boy was laughing so hard, he almost forgot mathematics altogether. Maria smiled. "They're good together." Mark nodded. "They always were." Mrs. Anderson eventually closed her exercise book. She looked around the restaurant. Children reading, neighbors talking, an elderly couple playing chess. A young mother was drinking coffee, while her son proudly was reading 3 pages without stumbling over a single word. Mrs. Anderson folded her hands. Very quietly she said, "I don't think this place is only a restaurant anymore." Mark looked around, then smiled. "I don't think it has been for quite some time." Late that afternoon, a tourist couple wandered inside. They had stopped because they liked the flowers in front of the windows. After a few minutes, the gentleman asked, "I'm sorry, who owns this place?" Mark looked around the dining room. At Sophie, helping with homework. At Lily, carrying lemonade to 3 children. At Mrs. Anderson, correcting spelling with the seriousness of a university professor. At Maria, laughing with 2 regular customers. Finally, he answered, "I suppose. All of us." The tourist smiled politely. They assumed he was joking. The regulars knew he wasn't. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Mark and Maria sat together on the little terrace outside. The street had become quiet. The last rays of sunlight painted the corner windows gold. Maria leaned her head against Mark's shoulder. "You've built something beautiful here." Mark shook his head. "No." He looked back through the restaurant window. Where Mrs. Anderson had forgotten her reading glasses. Where Sophie's history book still lay on the corner table. Where Lily had once again forgotten to put the sugar bowl back. He smiled. "I only opened the door." The summer seemed determined to stay forever. Every afternoon the restaurant filled with familiar voices. Children drifted in, carrying books they had promised to read before school started again. Parents stopped for coffee on their way home from work. Mrs. Anderson somehow managed to teach 3 children at once while insisting she was officially retired. Nobody believed her, least of all Mrs. Anderson herself. One warm Tuesday afternoon, Sophie looked up from her history book. "Mrs. Anderson? What are you doing tomorrow?" Mrs. Anderson looked genuinely surprised. At my age? She thought for a moment, hopefully waking up. Lily laughed so hard, she nearly dropped an entire tray of lemonade. Mrs. Anderson looked at her. "I didn't say it was guaranteed." The restaurant erupted in laughter. Sophie smiled too. Those moments had become wonderfully ordinary, and somehow, they were the moments everyone remembered. Later that afternoon, the restaurant became quiet again. The younger children had gone home. The lunch crowd had disappeared. Only the ceiling fan disturbed the silence. Mark and Maria were in the kitchen discussing wedding invitations. Mrs. Anderson had gone home for the afternoon. For once, Lily and Sophie were alone. Lily was doodling absent-mindedly on a paper napkin. Sophie was reading. After several quiet minutes, Lily spoke. "Can I ask you something?" Sophie didn't even look up. "You usually do." Lily smiled. "This one's different." Now, Sophie closed her book. "Okay." Lily hesitated. For perhaps the first time since they had met, she wasn't sure whether she should ask at all. Finally, she said softly, "How did you end up in the wheelchair?" Sophie looked toward the corner window. Outside, summer continued exactly as if nothing had ever gone wrong. Children rode bicycles. A dog chased a tennis ball. Someone laughed somewhere across the street. Finally, she answered, "Dad." Just one word. Lily frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Another long silence. "He didn't mean to." Lily said nothing. She knew there had to be more. Sophie folded her hands on the table. It was after COVID. Dad had finally been home for a while. He'd spent months covering the pandemic for the newspaper. He was taking camera equipment out to the car. I wanted to surprise him. A small smile crossed her face. I was going to hide in the back seat. The smile disappeared. I never made it. Lily's heart sank. Sophie continued quietly. He reversed out of the garage. He never saw me. The restaurant felt impossibly still. The doctors said the damage to the nerve couldn't be repaired. Lily swallowed. "I'm so sorry." Sophie gave a tiny shrug. It wasn't his fault. It wasn't really mine either. Lily looked serious. Then whose fault was it? Sophie smiled sadly. Sometimes things are nobody's fault. That sentence hung between them for a long time. Finally, Lily asked, "Was your dad arrested?" Sophie almost laughed. "No. He punished himself." Lily didn't understand. "What do you mean?" "He left." That sounded much heavier than it should have. "He became a war correspondent. He said people needed someone to tell their stories." Another pause. "I think he just couldn't stay." Lily looked down at the tabletop. "So you've hardly seen him?" Sophie slowly shook her head. "Postcards. Birthday presents. Christmas. He never forgot." Another pause. "He just never came home." Lily stared at the paper napkin in front of her. Finally, she asked the question nobody else had ever asked. "Do you think he stayed away because he thought you'd never forgive him?" Sophie answered immediately, "I wouldn't forgive him." Then she stopped. Her own certainty seemed to surprise her. Lily waited. She had learned from Mrs. Anderson that silence often produced better answers than questions. Finally, Sophie whispered, "I don't know." Another long silence. Then, almost too quietly to hear, "I stopped being angry about the wheelchair years ago." She looked out through the corner window again. "But when he didn't come home, I thought he'd stopped being my dad." Her voice broke, just slightly, not enough for tears, enough for Lily to hear. Without saying a word, Lily reached across the table. Sophie looked at the offered hand, then quietly took it. Two friends, sitting together. Until Lily finally smiled. "I think you're wrong." Sophie looked up. "About what?" "I don't think he stopped being your dad." She thought for another moment. I think he stopped believing that he deserved to be. Sophie didn't answer, but for the rest of the afternoon, she did not open her history book again. One by one, the familiar voices disappeared into the warm summer evening. Parents collected their children. Mrs. Anderson gathered the last spelling books into her canvas bag. As always, she paused beside the counter. See you tomorrow. Mark smiled. I suspect you will. Mrs. Anderson looked at Lily. I expect Chapter 5 to contain dragons. Lily grinned. I'll let the children know. Mrs. Anderson shook her head with mock disappointment. I knew I could rely on you. With that, she stepped out into the golden evening. A few minutes later, Maria closed her notebook. She looked toward Sophie. Ready? Sophie packed her history book into her backpack. She looked at Lily. See you tomorrow? Lily asked. You couldn't keep me away. I've tried. I noticed. The two girls laughed. Maria smiled at Mark. Don't stay up too late. Mark looked around the restaurant. I only have a few more things to do. You always say that. Because it's always true. Maria laughed. Good night. Good night. Together, mother and daughter stepped out onto Maple Street. Mark and Lily stood at the door until they had reached the corner. Sophie turned once and waved. Lily waved back. Then the two disappeared from sight. Mark quietly locked the front door. The little bell above it gave one final chime. The restaurant became wonderfully still. Only the soft humming of the refrigerators and the ticking wall clock disturbed the silence. Lily picked up the stack of menus. Mark straightened the last chairs. Neither of them hurried. They had performed this little evening routine together for years. Neither one really thought about it anymore. It was simply what they did. When the last table had been wiped and the coffee machine prepared for the morning, Lily stood for a moment, looking at the corner table. Mark noticed. Something on your mind? She nodded. I asked Sophie about her father today. Mark stopped drying a coffee cup. What did she say? Not much. Lily slowly folded the cleaning cloth. But enough. Mark waited. Lily had never been one to speak before she had finished thinking. I don't think he left, because he stopped loving her. Mark looked surprised. What makes you say that? Sophie is afraid he did. But the postcards, the birthday presents, the Christmas gifts. She shrugged. People who stop caring don't remember every birthday. Mark leaned against the counter. He had never looked at it that way. Lily continued quietly. She said he never forgot anything. Except coming home. Those words settled over the restaurant like the evening silence. Mark looked toward the empty corner table. I never thought about it like that. I don't think anyone has. Another long silence filled the room. Finally, Lily asked, Dad? Yes? If someone spends years believing they don't deserve to come home, how do they ever come back? Mark looked at his daughter. For a moment he saw not the confident young woman standing beside him, but the little girl who had once started helping in the restaurant because she thought that he needed her. Very gently he answered, I don't know. Lily smiled faintly. I think you do. Mark raised an eyebrow. Do I? You always tell people they're welcome here. She looked around the quiet restaurant. I think someone needs to tell him that too. Mark followed her gaze. The corner table looked different after closing. The chairs were neatly arranged. The lights had been dimmed. The corner table where Sophie always sat stood empty, waiting. Almost without thinking, Mark whispered, "Maybe you're right." Lily smiled. "I usually am." Mark laughed. "I wonder where you learned that." Lily grinned. "Mrs. Anderson." They both laughed. Then, without another word, they switched off the dining room lights. Together they walked through the familiar doorway leading to the apartment behind the restaurant. Outside, the corner table looked closed for the night. Inside, it was still home. The newspaper receptionist was kind. Perhaps she had answered similar questions before. "Mr. Martinez is currently back in London." Mark hadn't expected that. "He isn't overseas?" "No. He's preparing for another assignment." She hesitated. "I can give him your number." Mark smiled. "Thank you." He assumed that would be the end of it. It wasn't. The telephone rang the following afternoon. Mark answered while wiping coffee cups. The corner table. A short silence. Then a quiet voice. "Mark Sullivan?" "Speaking." Another pause. "My name is Daniel Martinez." Mark slowly put the cup down. "Good." Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, Daniel said, "Maria wrote me. You're getting married." "Yes." "I suppose congratulations are in order." "Thank you." Daniel finally sighed. "I also suppose you want to know why I did not answer." "I do." "I can't explain it over the telephone." Mark looked toward the dining room. Customers laughed. Children were reading. Sophie was explaining multiplication to a little girl. "I didn't think you could." Daniel seemed surprised. "You didn't?" "No." Another pause. "So, when can we meet?" There was another silence. Then Daniel quietly asked, "You'd really come?" Mark smiled to himself. "Of course." "You don't even know me." "No. But I know Sophie." Daniel laughed softly. It was the first laugh he had shared with anyone in a very long time. 2 days later, Mark boarded the earliest morning flight. He told almost nobody where he was going. Only Lily and Maria knew. Maria simply squeezed his hand. "Thank you." Mark smiled. "I haven't done anything yet." "You already have." Daniel suggested meeting in a small cafe overlooking the river. Not his office. Not the newspaper. Somewhere nobody knew either of them. Mark spotted him immediately. Not because he recognized him, because he saw the camera. It rested on the empty chair beside Daniel, as though it were an old friend. Daniel stood. For a moment the two men simply looked at one another. Then Daniel smiled. "You came. You sound surprised." "I am." They shook hands. Both men noticed the same thing. Neither one was what they had expected. Daniel looked tired. Not old. Simply tired. His hair had begun turning gray around the temples. There were tiny lines around his eyes. Not from age. From years spent squinting through a camera viewfinder. Mark noticed something else. Daniel smiled easily, but the smile never quite reached his eyes. It faded away on its way upwards. After ordering coffee, they sat quietly for a while. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I imagined this conversation many times since our phone call." Mark smiled. "So did I. I'm fairly certain None of my versions ended well. I was beginning to think mine won't either. For the first time, they both laughed a little. The tension eased, only a little, but enough. Daniel looked out across the river. You know, I never wanted to stop the wedding. Mark said nothing. I only wanted. He struggled to find the words. I didn't know if I had the right to let someone else become Sophie's father. Mark answered immediately. You don't. Daniel looked up sharply. His face showed despair. Then Mark continued. Because no one is trying to. Daniel stared at him. Mark leaned forward. I've never wanted your place. I couldn't take it if I tried. Sophie already has a father. He just isn't sitting at her table. Daniel looked down into his coffee. His voice became almost a whisper. I killed her childhood. Mark shook his head. No. I destroyed her future. No. I left. Yes. Daniel looked up. Finally, something honest. Something neither man could deny. For a long moment, they simply sat there. Then Mark quietly said, That's the thing you can still change. Daniel closed his eyes. When I look at her, I still see that afternoon. I hear her scream. I hear Maria shouting. I still wake up some nights, thinking I'm backing out of that garage. Mark waited. He had learned something from Mrs. Anderson. Sometimes silence was the kindest answer. Finally, Daniel looked at him. I don't deserve to come home. Mark smiled gently. I've been hearing the opposite. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Lily thinks you're wrong. Lily? Sophie's best friend. The girl who works at the restaurant. Daniel smiled faintly. I've seen her in the photographs Maria sends. Mark nodded. She asked one question. What question? If he stopped loving Sophie, why did he remember every birthday? Daniel looked away. I never forgot one. I know. Mark leaned back, then quietly said the sentence that had brought him there. Daniel, I didn't fly here to ask for your blessing. Daniel looked surprised. I came because there's still a chair waiting for you. Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't. He simply stared through the cafe window for a very long time. Outside, people hurried along the riverside, completely unaware that one broken family had just begun finding its way back together. Mark never told anyone what had happened in the cafe, not even Lily. When she asked whether Daniel had agreed to come home, he simply smiled. I don't know. You don't? I think he has to answer that question himself. Life at the corner table quietly continued. Summer seemed determined to last forever. Children still wandered in every afternoon, carrying books, board games, and half-finished homework. Mrs. Anderson still insisted she was only stopping by for tea. Nobody believed her, least of all Mrs. Anderson. Sophie still claimed the corner table every afternoon. Lily still insisted she wasn't helping anyone. Every few minutes, she simply happened to be exactly where someone needed help. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Only Mark occasionally found himself looking through the front windows toward Maple Street. Not because he expected Daniel, because he hoped. Thousands of miles away, Daniel packed a single suitcase. The camera that had traveled with him through deserts, floods, and war zones rested on top. He looked at it for a long time. then quietly zipped the suitcase closed. For the first time in years, he wasn't traveling toward another story. He was traveling back into his own. His flight landed shortly after noon. He collected his suitcase, walked through the terminal, ignored the taxi drivers calling after him. Instead, he rented a small car. The journey to Maple Street felt strangely familiar. Every traffic light, every intersection, every road sign awakened memories he had spent years trying to forget. When he finally reached the neighborhood, he didn't stop. He drove straight past the corner table. The restaurant looked exactly the way he remembered. Flower boxes beneath the windows, an old bicycle leaning against the fence, children laughing outside. For one brief moment, he almost turned into the parking space. Instead, he kept driving. The following morning, he came back. This time, he parked across the street. He remained inside the car. People came and went. Customers laughed. Children ran through the open doorway. He caught glimpses of Sophie through the corner window. She looked older, more confident. She laughed. He realized he had almost forgotten what her laugh sounded like. After 20 minutes, he started the engine and drove away. Next day was not different. Only this time, someone noticed him. Lily had been carrying 2 glasses of lemonade toward the window when she happened to glance outside. A silver car stood across Maple Street. A man sat quietly behind the steering wheel. He wasn't watching the restaurant. He was watching Sophie. Not in the curious way strangers sometimes looked. In the silent, aching way only a father could. Lily said nothing. She simply watched until the car eventually disappeared. That evening she mentioned it to Mark. "I think he came today." Mark looked up. "You think?" "I've never met him." She smiled. "But I think fathers look different." Mark couldn't help smiling. "What does that mean?" "I don't know. They just do." On the third afternoon, the silver car returned. This time it didn't leave. Lily noticed it immediately. She quietly placed a customer's coffee on the table, walked over to the counter, and looked at Mark. She didn't have to say a word. Mark followed her eyes. Across the street, Daniel sat in the parked car. His hands rested motionless on the steering wheel. For almost a minute, neither man moved. Finally, Mark untied his apron. "I'll be right back." Mrs. Anderson looked up from her tea. Without asking a single question, she simply nodded. "I thought you might." Mark crossed Maple Street. Daniel lowered the window. "I nearly drove away again." "I know." Daniel looked surprised. "How?" Mark smiled sadly. "Because I almost turned around outside the hospital after Lily's mother died." Daniel looked at him quietly. "I sat in the car for 20 minutes. I couldn't make myself walk inside." Daniel slowly nodded. "I understand." "I thought you would." For a while they simply stayed quiet. The corner table was only 20 yards away. It might as well have been another country. Daniel stared through the restaurant windows. "I've reported from wars. I've walked through bombed streets. I've interviewed men carrying rifles." He smiled sadly. "And somehow, this is the hardest doorway I've ever had to cross." Mark followed his gaze. "Because this one matters." Daniel nodded. "What if Sophie doesn't want to see me?" "I don't know." What if she's still angry? I don't know. And if I make everything worse? Mark smiled gently. I don't know. Daniel sighed quietly. You're not very reassuring. I know. Then Mark placed a hand on the roof of the car. But I do know one thing. Daniel looked at him. If you drive away today, you'll spend the rest of your life wondering what would have happened if you hadn't. Silence. Then Mark added, nothing inside that restaurant is waiting for a perfect human. It's waiting for a father. Daniel closed his eyes. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally, he picked up his suitcase. Together they crossed Maple Street. The little bell above the restaurant door rang, exactly as it had thousands of times before. Nobody looked up immediately. Then Mrs. Anderson slowly lowered her teacup. She studied Daniel for perhaps 2 seconds. Finally, she smiled. You're too thin. Daniel blinked, then laughed. A real laugh. I've been away a long time. I noticed. Mrs. Anderson stood, walked over to him, looked him up and down with the authority only retired teachers seem to possess. I was right. She pointed toward an empty chair. Sit. Daniel looked helplessly over to Sophie, then at Mark. Mark grinned. I would do what she says. Why? Because nobody has ever won an argument with Mrs. Anderson. Several regular customers laughed. Even Sophie smiled slightly. Mrs. Anderson disappeared into the kitchen. Daniel whispered, Where's she going? Mark smiled. Soup. Soup? Trust me. Daniel looked toward the corner table. Sophie had stopped reading. Their eyes met. Neither moved. Neither spoke. The restaurant became completely still. Finally, Daniel managed to say, Hi. His voice almost failed him. Sophie. For a long moment, she simply looked at him, at the father she had imagined returning 1,000 different ways. Then, very quietly, she said, Hi, Dad. Nothing more. No tears. No speeches. No dramatic embrace. Just 2 words. 5 years of silence. Beginning to disappear. At that exact moment, Mrs. Anderson returned, carrying a steaming bowl of soup. She placed it firmly in front of Daniel. You may continue repairing your family after you've had something to eat. The entire restaurant burst into laughter, including Sophie. Daniel looked around the room, at Mark, at Maria, at Lily, at Mrs. Anderson, at the children, at the neighbors, at the daughter he had missed for so long. For the first time in years, he no longer felt like a visitor. He felt like someone who had finally come home. The days before the wedding passed surprisingly quietly. Nobody spoke very much about Daniel's return. Nobody needed to. He simply kept coming back. The following morning he arrived before the restaurant opened. Mark was carrying flour from the delivery van. Without saying a word, Daniel picked up one of the big bags. Mark looked over. I thought journalists weren't supposed to carry things. Daniel smiled. We usually convince someone else to carry the camera. Mark laughed. Welcome to restaurant life. The 2 men carried the remaining sacks inside together. Neither one noticed Lily watching through the front window. She smiled to herself, then quietly returned to setting the tables. Later that morning, Sophie rolled into the restaurant as she always did. She noticed Daniel immediately. He looked up, smiled. Morning. Morning. Nothing more. No awkward explanations. No emotional speeches. Just one ordinary greeting. And somehow, that felt much more important. As the morning became busier, Daniel simply began helping. He carried chairs onto the terrace, filled sugar bowls, wiped tables. At one point he disappeared into the kitchen, carrying an empty tray. Mark looked after him. I didn't ask him to do that. Maria smiled. I know. They both watched quietly. He remembers. Mark looked puzzled. He remembers what? How to belong. Mrs. Anderson arrived just before lunch. She looked at Daniel, studied him carefully. Daniel froze. What? You've gained half a pound. Daniel laughed. Already? I've been feeding teachers' husbands, children, and stubborn fathers for 40 years. She nodded with satisfaction. Half a pound. My estimates are usually accurate. Daniel shook his head. I don't think I've ever been welcomed home with soup before. Mrs. Anderson looked almost offended. That's because you've been spending time in the wrong places. The nearby customers burst into laughter. One man said, You can't win this battle, mate. That afternoon Lily was wiping the counter when Daniel walked over. I owe you a thank you. She looked up, surprised. For what? For seeing something everyone else missed. Lily frowned. I didn't. You didn't? She shook her head. I just looked. Daniel smiled. You sound like Mrs. Anderson. Lily's face lit up. Best compliment I've had all week. Daniel laughed. I should have known you'd say that. Later, Sophie sat at her corner table wrestling with a history assignment. Daniel happened to walk past. Without thinking, he glanced at the page. Your date's wrong. Sophie looked up. It is. He nodded. Battle of Hastings. 1066. Sophie stared at the page, then laughed. I knew that. I know. So why didn't I write it? Daniel smiled. Because sometimes our brains decide to take the day off. She couldn't help laughing. So does yours? Frequently. For a moment they simply smiled at one another. Then Sophie quietly pushed the notebook toward him. Sit. Daniel did. Together they finished the assignment. No speeches. No apologies. Just a father helping his daughter with homework. Exactly as though 5 years had never passed. That evening Mark locked the front door. The restaurant had finally become quiet again. Daniel stood beside him. I should probably go too. Mark looked surprised. Why? I've been here all day. Mark smiled. So have I. Daniel hesitated. I don't want to get in the way. Mark looked around the empty restaurant, at the chairs waiting for tomorrow, at the corner table, at the familiar counter. Then he quietly answered, Daniel, I don't think you're in anybody's way anymore. For a long moment Daniel simply looked around the room. Finally he smiled. Thank you. Mark shook his head. You don't have to thank me. He switched off the dining room lights. You came home. That's the important part. The wedding morning arrived bright and warm. The little garden behind the old country inn looked as though it had been waiting for celebrations all summer. Lily helped arrange flowers. Sophie supervised from her wheelchair with great authority. I think that ribbon should be higher. Lily laughed. I thought you were the guest. I'm efficiently supervising. That sounds suspiciously like giving orders. I can do both. It's a gift. Daniel arrived wearing a dark blue suit. He looked uncomfortable, not because of the suit, because he still wasn't entirely certain he belonged there. Mrs. Anderson spotted him immediately. She marched across the lawn. Stand still. Daniel obeyed without question. She adjusted his tie, brushed an invisible speck of dust from his jacket. Step back. Daniel smiled nervously. What now? You still look too thin. Everyone nearby laughed. Mrs. Anderson reached into her handbag, produced a homemade cookie, placed it in Daniel's hand. There. Much better. Daniel looked helplessly at Mark. Does she always carry emergency cookies? Mark nodded. Always. Lily approached Mrs. Anderson. I bet you cry at weddings. Never. I have seen too many already. $5, said Lily. Done. The ceremony itself was simple, exactly the way Mark and Maria wanted it. There were no dramatic interruptions, no objections, no speeches about the past, only promises for the future. When Mark and Maria exchanged their vows, Lily glanced toward Mrs. Anderson. Mrs. Anderson looked straight ahead with perfect dignity. Lily smiled. She waited. It didn't take long. Just as the celebrant said, today 2 families become one. Mrs. Anderson reached discreetly for a tissue. Lily leaned toward Sophie, barely able to contain her grin. I told you. Sophie whispered back. You definitely did. The ceremony ended to warm applause. Guests wandered into the garden for the reception. The photographer gathered everyone together. One picture with the whole family. Almost without thinking, Daniel stepped backward, toward the second row, as though he still believed he belonged somewhere behind everyone else. Mark noticed. Without saying a word, he stepped aside, leaving the place beside Sophie empty. Daniel looked at him. Mark simply nodded. Daniel quietly moved into the space. The photographer smiled. Perfect. For the first time in many years, it truly was. Later, while the guests enjoyed coffee and cake beneath the old maple trees, Lily wandered over to Mrs. Anderson. She leaned close enough that only the 2 of them could hear. You know. Mrs. Anderson smiled suspiciously. What? You owe me $5. Mrs. Anderson sighed with theatrical disappointment. I was hoping you'd forgotten. Lily grinned. Not a chance. Mrs. Anderson opened her handbag with great ceremony. She produced a crisp $5 bill and placed it in Lily's hand. Then, with complete dignity, she said, for the record, I did not cry. Lily raised one eyebrow. No? Mrs. Anderson nodded firmly. She considered her wording very carefully. I merely experienced a brief interruption of my emotional equilibrium. Lily laughed so hard, she had to wipe tears from her own eyes. That's the longest way anyone has ever said, crying. Mrs. Anderson smiled. One should always choose one's words carefully. Then she added, and one never should squeeze money out of a poor retired teacher. She smiled, while Lily laughed out loud again. The afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the garden. Children chased one another between the flower beds. Someone laughed near the terrace. The photographer packed away his camera. Guests gathered in little groups, talking quietly beneath the old maple trees. For the first time all day, Nothing important seemed to be happening. And somehow, those were always the moments people remembered. Sophie looked toward the far end of the garden. There they are. Lily followed her eyes. On the other side of the lawn stood Mark and Maria near an old rose arbor. Beyond it, a narrow stone path disappeared into a small garden where lavender and wildflowers grew together. I've wanted to see that garden all afternoon. Lily stepped behind Sophie's wheelchair. Then let's go. Sophie smiled. I thought you'd never ask. Together they rolled toward the stone path. The path curved gently beneath the trees. For several moments neither girl spoke. They simply enjoyed the warm afternoon. Finally Sophie smiled. You know what? I never thought today would happen. The wedding? Sophie shook her head. No. She looked at Lily. This. Lily frowned. What do you mean? Sophie laughed softly. I thought I'd always be an only child. Lily pretended to think about it. Well, you still are. Sophie looked puzzled. I am? Obviously. Lily grinned. I'm not your sister. No? No. What are you then? Lily smiled. I'm your favorite pain in the neck. Sophie burst into laughter. I'll allow that. Ahead of them, the stone path became uneven where the roots of an old oak had gently lifted the ground over many years. The wheelchair slowed. Almost automatically. Lily adjusted her grip. She had done it so many times, she no longer thought about it. Back near the terrace, Mark noticed the path. Maria turned. Daniel had already started walking toward them. Mrs. Anderson quietly folded her napkin and stood. All four adults moved across the lawn. The girls reached the little rise. Lily stopped for a moment, looked at the uneven ground, then at Sophie. Sophie looked back. Neither one seemed particularly worried. By then, the four adults were only a few steps away. Mark smiled. Need a hand? Maria nodded. We can help. Daniel had almost reached them. So can I. Mrs. Anderson, naturally, arrived last. I've been supervising all of you for years. Everyone laughed. Lily looked at Sophie. Sophie looked at Lily. Without planning it, without rehearsing it, without even thinking, they answered together. Exactly together. We got it. For one wonderful second, everyone simply stood there. Then Lily gently tilted the wheelchair back. Sophie leaned exactly as she had learned. The front wheels rolled over the uneven ground. Then the back wheels followed. A tiny lurch, a tiny laugh, and they were through. The girls continued down the garden path, talking over each other, laughing about something only they understood. The conversation slowly disappeared beneath the trees. Neither one looked back. They didn't need to. They already knew. Everyone they loved was there. The four adults remained where they were, watching them disappear. Daniel smiled quietly. His eyes were suspiciously bright. Mrs. Anderson noticed. She gently slipped a clean handkerchief into his jacket pocket, just in case. Without turning around, Daniel smiled. Thank you. Mrs. Anderson nodded. I thought you might need it. Mark slipped his hand into Maria's. Neither one spoke. There wasn't anything left to say. The restaurant had given Sophie a friend. Life had given her a sister. Some families begin with birth. Others begin with marriage. The very fortunate ones begin with kindness. And sometimes, all it takes is one person opening a door